We've been hearing so much about the lockdown economy, testing, and the number of people who are now ill. But there's another way of looking at it. Let's suppose that 250,000 people, 250,000 today, are suffering from COVID-19. That's far greater than the official figure the government have been releasing, because their figures are only based on the people who've had a positive test. And it may well be that altogether 250,000 people are carrying the virus. It means, though, that 67,886,011 people are incarcerated who are perfectly healthy and who, until they contact somebody with the virus, have nothing in the world to worry about. It's a bit like in school where one or two kids are naughty, so the entire class has to be kept in. In logical terms, it makes no sense at all. We've also had so many claims made about testing. There being a government target of about 100,000 people a day being tested. Well, yes, I know that the figures have been fiddled. I'm not contesting that. But let's say that the actual number of tests every day is close to 100,000. It would take 2 years to test everybody once. And the only way you're going to get on top of this epidemic is to test people often enough to know who is catching it and how the disease is spreading. But then in Britain, our National Public Health Service has been determined to keep all the testing to themselves. The people who actually run other labs, which could do the PCR testing that identifies the genes within the virus genome, they haven't been allowed to get involved in the testing. They could greatly increase the number of tests. But no, we still have it nicely lined up that the nationalised body does the testing, and so far nobody else has been allowed to get a look in. So how are the tests done? Well, in the old days it was quite hard to work out which genes were where. But gene sequencing, genetic sequencing, was discovered by a great old friend of mine, Fred Sanger. He was a wonderful man. When he retired, they said, you can have access to the lab and continue your research. And Fred said, no, I've retired. I've given my life to science. I'm going to go home and grow roses. And that's exactly what he did. Fred's technique could not be used routinely and on a large scale. To that we owe the discovery of the polymerase chain reaction, which was done by Kary Mullis. Now, he and I used to correspond a lot. We never met when I was in California, which is a shame. He's a completely crazy man and was said to have had his idea whilst high as a kite up amongst the Californian marigolds in the hills overlooking the Pacific Ocean. His technique meant that you could amplify enormously the number of genes in a sample. So you had, as it were, a spoonful to play with, instead of just the slightest trace on a microscope slide. And now we have CRISPR, which stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats. Now that mouthful simply means that you can identify where you're going to cut off little bits of genetic material and recognise it. And there has been talk of adapting this technique so that we could actually use it to carry out a test for COVID-19 in perhaps half an hour. Now that would be a tremendous benefit. It's something that at the moment takes all day. It seems that our present epidemic in Britain started when Darren Bland, who'd been out at a conference in Southeast Asia, stopped us for a skiing weekend in Austria. He went to the Kitzloch bar, known for its intimacy and close person-to-person dancing, and it seems that that's where everybody had contact with the virus. He became ill on the 20th of January. By the 11th of March, there had been 456 cases and 8 deaths from COVID-19. We knew whom they were and where they were. And it was about that time that the World Health Organization announced this is going to be a global pandemic. So what did we do in Britain? Well, based doubtless on some experts' advice, we stopped tracing the contacts. There are now probably 250,000 cases in Britain as far as we can guess, and there have been over 30,000 deaths. We've been told so many times, haven't we, that viruses don't discriminate. Oh yes, they do. If you're black or Asian, you stand a far greater chance of suffering terrible consequences from this virus. If you're fat, you stand a much greater chance of suffering bad consequences than if you're thin. When the Prime Minister was reinstated in the House after his unhappy sojourn in hospital and then recuperating in the luxury of checkers. I'd have much preferred it if he'd been honest enough to say, I was told don't shake hands, I was told keep away from people, but I did not follow the advice and as a result I nearly died. That wasn't said, and that really would have rubbed the lesson home. We keep talking as though we're the only ones doing anything. For example, there has been very much fanfare attached to the app now being trialled on the Isle of Wight. Yes, British technicians have developed an app. We're late in the market. Already a dozen countries have been successfully using apps for a long time. Chinese were first. After they released the full genetic coding of the virus in January, they also released an app which required Chinese citizens to keep contact with their phones, and they received automatic notifications if they went close to somebody who suffered from the disease, and if they went out when they weren't supposed to, a warning message flashed up. The police could intervene. They were obliged to stay home. And now, those cities in China are opening up for business, and the disease is on the decline. Our app isn't as good as they say anyway. There are some phones on which it doesn't like to work. And all it does is to ask you, voluntarily, to make a note of the symptoms that you develop. That isn't good enough. Currently, 8 or 9 other countries are considering apps, most of them based on tried and tested software from places like Singapore and South Korea, where we know the apps work. We've heard much about the infringement of privacy, of personal freedom and individual liberty. But that needs to be carefully considered. Here we're dealing with something that, as we've seen, can decimate the economy of the entire world. Here is something that can kill people in their prime and in very large numbers. This is a major threat to the way in which we live our lives. It's not going to kill most of us. It's not the end of civilization. But it's going to cause massive changes. And I wonder whether civil liberties and personal freedom should actually be carefully reconsidered. Now, I'm the last person ever to say a thing like that. But when I originally proposed biohazard legislation and laid down what kind of regulations we needed for the safe control of bacteria and viruses, a framework that has been adopted around the world since I first proposed it, I worded my original submission within the framework of the other controls that we already have. In Britain, you can't run around the countryside with a loaded revolver because somebody might get hurt. In Britain, you can't own certain breeds of dangerous dog in case somebody might be hurt. So how should it be that in Britain you can have a virus at home, but nobody must be allowed to know that you've got it, and they certainly shouldn't be allowed to know whom you've met and who might have caught it from you? That, in the modern era of mass transportation, of global connections, and of easy contact, simply doesn't make sense. There is a continued tendency to big everything up. When exhibition centres were equipped with beds and equipment, the government said, we have built hospitals, when no such thing had happened. And now we hear them saying that we have done tests because we have home test kits. But they're not home test kits. They're nothing like a home test kit. With a home test kit, you take a little sample, you put it in a little plastic file or smear it on some paper, and the colour of the result tells you at once what the answer is. These are home sampling kits. They're just cotton buds in an envelope. That's all it is. And I doubt whether most people are going to use them properly. The folk I know who are researching the virus say that it actually resides right back, way back, deep inside the nose. Most people are just going to shove the bud up the front of their nostrils and send it off, and that's not going to show anybody anything. But let's stop bigging things up. We haven't built hospitals, and we don't have home tests. When we do have a home test, life will become a lot easier for all of us. Believe me. With every policy announcement, we keep hearing that the authorities are guided by what the experts tell them. Well, that's a fairly easy statement to make, because almost every expert will tell them something different. So you can, in essence, pick whatever you like and choose that as your policy. Experts in this kind of area are very often driven as much by the need to make money for their department and glory from themselves. Do you know, there ought to be a book in that. In fact, I've got a sneaky feeling that just such a book is coming out later this year. Social separation has become a buzzword, but it's physical distance between us that we need to emphasise, not social separation at all. Socially, especially through social media, we need to be as close as we can manage to be. It's physical distance between us that matters. So, no, there should never have been the locking up of parks. Parks must be the safest places anybody can go, so long as groups keep apart from each other. Those drones chasing hapless hikers across the Derbyshire moors, what a ridiculous thing that was. Those people were the safest they could be if they were infected, and the safest they could stay if they weren't. And there was the policeman with a loud hailer shouting at some hapless youth sunbathing on a lawn. I have never seen anything more ridiculous. The parks should be open, the moors should be open. People should be able to go out and enjoy themselves. That's not to say that city dwellers should suddenly invade all the country cottages. No, that wouldn't be right. The health service in the country is not up to dealing with a lot of townies who are just escaping conveniently to their holiday homes. Going into supermarkets must have caused a tremendous amount of cross-infection, far more than going to the park ever could. We can all agree that a crowded pub isn't a good idea, but surely there must be a way of allowing people to go to a spacious beer garden. One can see why church services might not be appropriate. But that shouldn't be a reason to shut down churches and cathedrals that people could visit when there's plenty of space to do so. I can imagine why supermarkets could possibly have restrictions, but I can't imagine why anybody should say only one person per trolley. Husbands and wives who are together all the time often like to go shopping together, and I can see no reason why they shouldn't. I can see even less reason why a garden centre should ever be closed. What we do is largely up to us. We've been listening to avuncular, benevolent, authoritative spokesmen. But the truth of the matter is that the matter lies in our hands, not in theirs. An assured manner is not the same as an assurance that they really know what they're talking about. And finally, what about that legendary value R? R is the ratio of the people who've got it to the people who get it. And sometimes people say, well, it's down to 0.5 or it's up to 0.9. Nobody knows what it is. R is something you can calculate after an epidemic, when you could see just how many people really caught it. But we don't know who's got it. We don't know who's caught it. We don't know whether the people who've got it are. We have so little knowledge about this because we have simply adopted the technique of locking everybody at home so nobody can catch it. The time is getting closer when we can let people out. People in an age group which is not going to expose them to unnecessary risks. People who can afford to keep a distance apart from each other. People who can enjoy the countryside, enjoy the parks, but also can work in offices where they know they're going to be safe and separate from others who might infect them. We need to test people on a scale that nobody has even begun to discuss. People talk a lot about the whack-a-mole strategy, but we don't know where the moles are, and we haven't anything to whack them with. At present, it is physical separation that's going to dictate our future. If we can do that, the number of cases will fall. If we don't, they won't. It isn't up to the government. It's up to you and me and nobody else.